Would you have the courage to trust in love again, even if it has already broken your heart once? Harrison Cole entered the ballroom of New York's luxurious Astoria Hotel with a practiced smile, but his eyes scanned the room with the precision of someone searching for imperfections in an expensive painting. The soft piano music in the background, the warm glow of Christmas lights reflecting off the polished marble, and the muffled laughter of guests created a perfect setting. It was the kind of environment he should dominate, but at that moment, Harrison felt like an intruder. He adjusted his dark tie with an automatic gesture as he walked among the guests, greeting investors and colleagues with the efficiency of a well-calibrated machine. As CEO of Cole Resorts, his presence there was essential to strengthening business relationships at a delicate time. The once untouchable company was facing significant losses. Harrison knew that expanding into alternative markets was his only chance to save the empire his father had built. But the impeccable facade he displayed did not reveal the layers of concern that accompanied him. As she stopped to get a glass of champagne, her personal assistant, Mark, approached. Mark, a middle-aged man with gray hair and a calm expression, always seemed to have control of everything, even in the most chaotic situations. He whispered in a discreet tone, "Mrs. Carlton from Whiteleaf Investments is asking about your project in Aspen. She seems eager for details." Harrison nodded, although the idea of getting into yet another conversation about numbers and projections tired him. He knew that in public he could not afford to show weakness or hesitation. With a firm movement, he addressed Mrs. Carlton, projecting confidence, but feeling that the distance between the image he had constructed and his true essence increased with each interaction. Across the room, a group of guests discussed Harrison's personal life in hushed tones. He heard fragments. "They say he has no one. I heard he left someone important at the altar, years ago." The truth was that he knew how to deal with rumors. They were inevitable for someone at his level of exposure. Still, those words, so familiar, always found a way to poke at a wound he would rather forget. Meanwhile, at a smaller but equally sophisticated hotel, CEO Clara Bennett adjusted the flower arrangement in the lobby with the same obsessive attention she paid to every detail of her business. Clara was the heart of Bennett Hospitality, a boutique chain known for its sustainable approach and welcoming charm. His hotels were smaller, but his achievements were far from ignored. With her hair tied up in an elegant bun and dressed in a navy blue blazer that exuded authority, Clara checked the venue's Christmas decorations one last time before guests arrived for a charity event. When the hotel manager approached with a worried expression, Clara realized that something was out of place. "The main Christmas tree has some lights burned out, Mrs. Bennett. We're trying to replace them, but we don't have time before the guests arrive." Clara took a deep breath and replied firmly, "Let's not let this get in the way. Remove the entire row if necessary. Make sure everything else is perfect." The tone of his voice left no room for discussion. For Clara, there was no room for failure, either in her professional or personal life. Despite the controlled smile she offered her employees, there was something about Christmas time that always made her restless. The spirit of joy contrasted sharply with a memory she couldn't erase: the day Harrison Cole left her waiting at the altar, exposed to pitying looks and silent judgments, yet here she was, years later, leading a prosperous and admired company. As she looked at the arriving guests, Clara remembered that she owned her story now. But even though her success had fulfilled her in many ways, there was something that no award or professional recognition could replace. That moment, as the spirit of Christmas united two separate worlds, Clara and Harrison were about to be on a collision course. And destiny, already duly decorated with lights and garlands, began to weave the first threads of their reconnection. The morning at the Cole Resorts office began with the glow of golden light streaming in through the large windows and illuminating Harrison Cole's desk. He was examining the model of the Colorado land project closely, his fingers skimming the outline of the proposal. The property, a space surrounded by snow-capped mountains, was essential to the company's recovery. Turning it into a luxury resort would be the perfect move to attract high-end guests during the winter seasons. Mark, always punctual, came in with a brown leather briefcase. "I brought news of the land auction in Colorado," he said, placing the folder on the table. "It appears that Bennett Hospitality is also interested." Harrison looked up, frowning. "Clara Bennett?" he asked, the name falling from his lips with a weight he hadn't expected. His heart gave a slight stumble, but he covered it quickly, taking control. "Yes. It seems they are willing to invest heavily to expand into the resort market." Harrison took a deep breath. For years, he had avoided any mention of Clara's name. Not because the competition between them was fierce, but because the sound of that name always brought back a wave of memories that he preferred to keep buried. "Prepare the jet. I'm going to Denver this afternoon," Harrison said, trying to ignore the slight tension building in his chest. He had no choice. Hours later, the hall where the proposals were to be presented was full of investors, lawyers, and representatives of competing companies. Harrison entered with his usual magnetic presence, his gray suit impeccably tailored, but feeling a hint of anxiety that wasn't common in situations like this. When his eyes met Clara Bennett for the first time in a decade, it was as if time had stopped. She was in the center of the room, having a casual conversation with an investor. Her brown hair tied into an elegant bun, her confident posture and serene expression made her an almost untouchable vision. But there was something in her expression that he recognized immediately, a strength he hadn't seen before, a carefully constructed armor. Harrison froze for a moment, unable to look away. Clara was both a painful memory and an overwhelming presence in the present. His chest tightened with a mixture of guilt and surprise. She had changed so much and, at the same time, nothing. Clara noticed his gaze before he could even look away. Their eyes met, and she kept her expression firm, as if she had been waiting for this moment for years. "Harrison," she said with a slight wave, her voice firm and professional but devoid of any warmth. "Clara," he replied, trying hard to maintain his composure. The two stood face to face for brief seconds that seemed like an eternity. Harrison felt a wave of conflicting emotions. He forced himself to smile, but the smile disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. "I see that we are competing for the same ground," Clara said. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of irony that didn't escape Harrison. "It seems that the business world is smaller than we imagined." He tried to respond, but felt the words catch in his throat. Finally, he said, "The terrain is strategic. I'm sure we both know what's at stake." Clara tilted her head slightly, her eyes assessing every detail of his expression. "Still so logical, Harrison. Always so pragmatic." Harrison noticed the subtle teasing, but knew responding wouldn't help. He knew he deserved much more than Clara's sharp words. She seemed unfazed, as if his presence had no impact whatsoever. It hit him in an unexpected way. As the meeting began, Harrison struggled to stay focused. Clara presented her proposal with an eloquence that left the room mesmerized. She detailed Bennett Hospitality's vision for the space, emphasizing sustainability and positive impact for the local community. Harrison watched as she dominated the room, each word filled with purpose and determination. It was as if she had transformed into the woman he had always known she would be, and he was no longer a part of it. After the meeting, Harrison found Clara in the hallway. He couldn't help it. "Clara, can we talk?" She stopped, turning slowly. For a moment, he thought he saw something in her eyes, perhaps a shadow of emotion, a chink in the armor. But then she lifted her chin and replied coolly, "I don't see what there is to argue about, Harrison. Our past stayed exactly where it should." In the past, those words, delivered with surgical precision, hit him deeper than he cared to admit. Clara turned and walked away, leaving Harrison alone in the hallway, with his own demons and the weight of the choices he had made 10 years ago. The meeting room in Denver's central business district was cold and stark, with glass walls that offered a panoramic view of the snow-capped mountains. The landscape seemed peaceful, but inside the room, the tension was palpable. Clara Bennett occupied the center of the table with impeccable posture. Her voice echoed around the room as she presented the strengths of her proposal for the Colorado site. Clara projected an unwavering confidence, every word carefully chosen to emphasize the innovation and sustainability her company could offer. His body language was calculated, a mix of cool professionalism and intense determination. She knew that everyone in the room, including Harrison, was evaluating not only her proposal, but her presence. Harrison, sitting at the other end of the table, kept his face alert, but inside he was seething. He tried to focus on the content of what Clara was saying, but his mind constantly wandered to the past. The woman who spoke with such conviction was not just a ruthless competitor, she was the same person who once looked at him with unconditional love. Now, her eyes didn't recognize him in the same way. When Clara concluded her presentation, one of the investors smiled with satisfaction. "Impressive, Mrs. Bennett. Its approach is modern and aligned with market trends." Harrison felt the weight of approval in the man's words and knew he needed to react quickly. He stood up, his presence dominating the room. He began to speak calmly, outlining how Cole Resort's proposal also incorporated sustainability, but with the touch of luxury that his brand was already known for offering. He addressed the investors directly, but his voice was a little firmer when responding to Clara's points. Clara, always attentive, noticed. In a moment, she tilted her head slightly, her eyes appraising his speech with a faint glint of challenge. After a fierce debate about implementation costs, Clara took advantage of a break to deliver a strategic blow. "What Cole Resorts offers is undoubtedly sophisticated, but the market is changing. Sustainability is no longer a trend, it is a necessity. Without this as a priority, even the wealthiest customers will flock to brands that care." The comment, subtle but incisive, echoed throughout the room. Harrison maintained his composure, but inside he felt the impact. He knew Clara was right, but part of his irritation came from the fact that she seemed to know him too well to the point that she could hurt him, even years later. At the end of the day, Harrison found Clara in the building's lobby. She was at the entrance, adjusting her woolen scarf around her neck. Snow was beginning to fall outside, the flakes piling up on the glass windows. "Clara," he called, his voice calm but full of tension. She turned, her calculating gaze landing on him. "What it was?" "Anything to add about today's meeting?" Harrison hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching hers. For years, he had rehearsed 1,000 things to say if he had the chance to explain himself, but now, in front of her, the words seemed inadequate. He forced himself to smile, trying to break the barrier. "Can we talk for a moment?" Without the formality, Clara raised an eyebrow. "Without the formality? We're here as competitors, Harrison." "I see no reason to remove the formality." He sighed, crossing his arms. "Don't you think we have unresolved issues?" Clara took a deep breath, squeezing her scarf a little tighter than necessary. "I don't have time for unresolved issues. I'm too busy running my company and winning bids, as you saw today." Harrison stepped forward, lowering his voice. "Clara, listen to me." She cut him off quickly, her voice cold as the snow outside. "I won't waste my energy revisiting the past. He has already taught me everything I needed to know." Harrison stood there, watching her leave. She walked with a stiff posture, but he could tell from the way she clenched her hands at her sides that her words weren't as immune as they seemed. He knew Clara too well to believe that she had actually buried everything. In the following days, interactions between the two continued to be fraught with tension. At every meeting or conference, Clara found ways to challenge him, testing his arguments with a precision that left him constantly on the defensive. She seemed to have the upper hand, controlling every moment with the grace of someone who knew exactly where she was going. But Harrison also noticed something else. When Clara thought no one was looking, her gaze wavered. He saw her staring at the snow outside the window in a quiet moment, and for a moment her expression was almost melancholy. It was as if, behind all her strength, she was still dealing with the shadows of the past. Harrison, on the other hand, felt a battle within himself. Part of him wanted to beat Clara, to prove that he was still the man she admired. But another part knew this competition wasn't about business. He needed something more, something that money or power could never provide. Snow fell incessantly in Denver, covering the city with a blanket of white that seemed to transform everything into a landscape frozen in time. Harrison was in the hotel lobby, his fingers tapping his cell phone as he confirmed for the third time all flights to New York had been cancelled. He looked to the side, finding Clara, who was keeping a firm expression while talking on the phone with her team. She was only a few feet away, but she seemed untouchable, as if an invisible barrier separated her from the rest of the world, especially him. Harrison took a deep breath, trying to ignore the irony of the situation. Both were trapped in the same hotel due to the blizzard, and the forecast indicated that they would be there for at least 2 days. He knew this forced closeness would be a test of his self-control. Hours later, in the hotel lounge, Clara was sitting in one of the leather armchairs near the fireplace. She held a hot coffee, watching the fire as the flames danced. His mind, however, was far from there. It wasn't fair. Everything she had built after that day, her company's success, her public image, even her own sense of self-worth, felt somehow fragile under the weight of Harrison's presence. How could he do this to her just by being in the same room? Harrison approached slowly, holding 2 cups of coffee. He stopped next to her, hesitating. "Can I sit down?" Clara looked up at him, her expression neutral, but her eyes carried a gleam of emotional weariness. "You're already here," she replied in a tone that was cutting but less harsh than usual. He sat down, handing her one of the glasses. "I thought you might like one more." Clara accepted the coffee without thanking him, but couldn't help but glance at him briefly. He looked different. The Harrison Cole of years ago always displayed an unwavering confidence, as if the world were in his hands. Now there was something more human about him, almost vulnerable. "The blizzard is getting worse," he commented, breaking the silence. "Looks like we're stuck here for a while." Clara gave a short smile, but there was no humor in it. "It's not like I have a choice." Harrison looked at her, trying to take in something beyond her words. "Clara, she interrupted, raising her hand. "Please don't start. We are not here to remember anything." "Why do you always avoid this?" he asked, his voice firm but not aggressive. "Don't you think that, after everything, we should at least talk about what happened?" Clara stared at him, and for a moment, the unshakable facade seemed to waver. But then she sat up straighter, crossing her arms. "There's nothing to talk about, Harrison. You made your choice. And I learned to move on." Harrison sat back, running a hand through his hair. He knew he was putting pressure on her, but something inside him needed to understand what she really felt. "I didn't move on," he admitted, his voice low but full of sincerity. "Not completely." Clara pursed her lips, looking away. This confession was like a knife in his armor. For years, she constructed a narrative for herself that Harrison was a closed chapter. But hearing that, it was hard to ignore. That night, as the hotel was plunged into the silence of the storm, Clara was unable to sleep. Harrison's words echoed in her mind, and she found herself being pulled back to that day, the day that changed everything. The flashback came with the force of a memory repressed for too long. She found herself at the altar, dressed in white, the flowers in her hands trembling slightly with nervousness and anticipation. The guests were there, all familiar and friendly faces. But Harrison wasn't there. What hurt her most wasn't the public humiliation. It was the emptiness he felt when he realized he had simply given up on them. The next day, the hotel organized a series of impromptu activities for guests stranded by the blizzard. Harrison and Clara ended up in a group that made Christmas cookies. It was an almost comical scene, Clara with a serious expression as she tried to decorate a star-shaped cookie, Harrison at her side, watching her with a mixture of admiration and caution. "You always took things so seriously," he commented. With a smile on the side of his mouth, Clara looked up at him, ready to launch a sharp retort, but stopped. His gaze was disarming, almost warm. She felt a small crack in her resolve. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument they had ever had. Clara looked away, focusing back on the cookie. "You think it's so easy, don't you? That just makes a comment or two, and everything can go back to the way it was before." Harrison looked at her for a long moment, his expression serious. "I never thought it was easy. If it were, I wouldn't have left you." Clara felt the air escape from her lungs. This was what she always wanted to hear, but at the same time, it was too late. Or was it not? Harrison walked down the silent hotel hallway, the muffled sound of falling snow echoing softly through the windows. The storm continued, and the forced isolation was starting to become more than just physical. He felt the weight of every minute shared with Clara, every exchange of words that seemed to take them closer or further away from each other. That morning, Harrison had a virtual meeting with Mark to discuss strategies for approaching the terrain in Colorado. As they discussed the details, Mark brought up a piece of information that made Harrison stop mid-sentence. "Clara founded Bennett Hospitality shortly after you." He hesitated, trying to measure his words. "After you left that marriage." Harrison froze, the coffee cup in his hand suddenly becoming heavier. He asked in a low tone, "What do you mean?" Mark looked uncomfortable, but continued, "It seems like her idea for the company came about as a reaction to what happened. She wanted to create something that represented different values, something that showed she could build something great on her own." With each word, Harrison felt as if the ground beneath his feet was disappearing. He remembered Clara from that time, a woman full of dreams and confidence. He never imagined that his decision to leave her would shape not only his heart but also his future. When the meeting ended, Harrison sat at the table for a long time, staring at the blank screen of his laptop. The guilt he had carried for years seemed to grow, as if it had finally found a tangible form. Later, in the hotel lounge, Harrison sat in a discreet corner as other guests chatted around. He didn't notice that Clara was on the other side of the room, looking distant while drinking hot tea. Harrison's longtime friend, Jack, who was also stuck at the hotel, came over to greet him. Jack was an old friend from college and, even with the years apart, he always managed to extract something sincere from Harrison. "You seem distracted," Jack commented, as he pulled up a chair. "What are you catching?" Harrison looked at him, trying to ignore the growing weight in his chest. "I'm stuck here with Clara," he said finally, his voice filled with an honesty he rarely demonstrated. Jack raised his eyebrows. "Clara? Clara Bennett? Clara who?" "Yes," Harrison cut in, avoiding Jack's gaze. The same. Jack was silent for a moment, waiting for Harrison to continue. When he didn't, Jack pressed, "What then? Is this bad?" Harrison let out a tired sigh, rubbing his face with his hands. "It's not about being bad or good, Jack. It's about what I did. What I missed." Jack leaned forward, curious. "Do you still think about it? After so long?" Harrison stared at the cup of coffee in front of him, the steam rising in gentle spirals. "I think about it every day," he admitted, almost in a whisper. "Every day I wonder what could have been different if I had stayed. I was afraid of not being enough for her. And in the process, I hurt her in ways I could never fix." On the other side of the room, Clara, without meaning to, caught parts of the conversation. She hadn't been listening on purpose, but Harrison's words reached her like an unexpected whisper in the silence. Clara stood still, her fingers lightly gripping the teacup. For years, she was convinced that Harrison didn't think about her, that his choice to leave her had been made without regret. But hearing that destabilized her. She didn't react immediately. Instead, he got up and left the lounge, trying to organize his thoughts that were now in disarray. Later, Harrison found her in the hotel's small library, leafing through a book without really paying attention. He hesitated at the door, watching her for a moment. She looked so calm on the outside, but he knew there was so much more going on inside. "Clara," he said, his voice soft but heavy. She didn't look at him immediately, continuing to turn the pages of the book as if he wasn't there. After a long moment, she replied, "Are you in the habit of talking about me behind my back?" Harrison felt his heart sink. Then she listened. "It wasn't my intention," he said. I was just being honest. Clara finally looked up at him, and Harrison saw something in her gaze that he couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper, more complex. Honest? She repeated, with a slight bitterness in her voice. And do you think this changes anything? I don't know, Harrison admitted. But it needed to be said. Clara closed the book carefully, placing it on the table. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes sparkled with an emotion she struggled to contain. It's no use, Harrison. You can't go back in time and fix what you did. He took a step forward, the desperation in his voice beginning to show. What if I can try? Clara was silent, the weight of those words hanging between them. She wanted to believe it was too late, but a part of her, a small but persistent part, was beginning to question that. The storm had finally died down, but the air was still cold and heavy. The hotel was beginning to return to its normal rhythm. Guests were busy planning their returns or reorganizing their commitments. Harrison, however, had something completely different in mind. He knew he couldn't let Clara go without at least trying to reconnect in a meaningful way. It was Mark who gave him the perfect opportunity. During a brief call, Mark mentioned that Clara would be the keynote speaker at a charity conference at the hotel itself, an event organized to raise funds for a cause she supported, building shelters for vulnerable families. Harrison decided he couldn't just watch. He needed to do something that would show Clara that he saw all of her strength, her passion, her determination. The conference was underway in the hotel's large event hall, decorated simply but with a welcoming feel that reflected Clara's spirit. Soft lights illuminated the stage where Clara stood, holding the microphone with calm confidence. She spoke about the importance of creating places where people feel safe, especially during the most difficult times in their lives. His words resonated with the audience, and the applause at the end of his speech was almost deafening. Harrison was sitting in the background, watching her every move. It was impossible not to admire the passion with which she gave herself to the cause, the sparkle in her eyes as she spoke about something bigger than herself. And it was even more impossible to ignore the emptiness in his chest when he thought that, through his own fault, he wasn't part of her journey. When it was time for major donors to take the stage to say a few words, Harrison surprised even himself by volunteering to speak. Clara was coming down from the stage when she heard Harrison's name being announced. She stopped, her body freezing for a moment. I didn't expect him to be involved in the event, much less take the microphone. Harrison took the stage with a confident stance, but those who knew him well like Clara could see a slight tension in his shoulders. He held the microphone and began to speak, his voice firm but charged with emotion. And good night. First, I would like to congratulate Clara Bennett on her speech and the incredible work she does. His vision for creating safe spaces is not only admirable, is essential. Clara felt her heart accelerate. He was doing it, publicly. Harrison continued. For many of us, fresh starts are a choice. For others, they are a necessity. Sometimes a fresh start means leaving something you love behind. Other times, it means finding the courage to face what you left behind. He paused, eyes sweeping the room but settling on Clara for a brief second. I'm here today because I believe we all deserve a second chance. It doesn't matter how far we've strayed or how many mistakes we've made. Clara realized she was holding her breath. Every word seemed to be directed at her. Even though he spoke to the entire room, Harrison ended with a promise of significant financial support for the charity project, but Clara barely heard that part. Her mind was occupied with what he had just done, opening himself in a way she had never seen before. Later, as the guests dispersed and the donations were celebrated, Clara found Harrison in the corner of the room. He stood alone, holding a glass of red wine, looking more introspective than triumphant. She approached, crossing her arms. I didn't know you were so good at inspiring speeches, she said, her tone neutral but full of curiosity. Harrison gave a brief but genuine smile. It's not the kind of thing I do often. But I thought it was worth a try. Clara arched an eyebrow. Was it worth it? He took a deep breath, placing the glass on a nearby table. Clara, He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I wanted you to know that I admire what you have done with your life. With your company. And that don't finish, she interrupted, her voice softer than he expected. Don't apologize again. Harrison looked at her, surprised. She seemed more vulnerable now, less protected by her usual defenses. Clara looked away, biting her lower lip as if she was trying to control something. What you said up there, was it sincere? He took a step closer, his voice low and intense. Every word. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of it all. She wanted to believe him. I wanted it so much. But there was something inside her that still resisted, a deep fear that wasn't easy to ignore. Let's see, she said finally, her voice filled with a mix of defiance and hope. Let's see if you've really changed. And with that, she turned away, leaving him alone again, but this time with a small spark of hope shining through them both. The snow had completely ceased, leaving the world outside in a silence that seemed to echo in Clara's heart. She was in the hotel lounge, sitting in a leather armchair next to the fireplace. The light from the flames danced across his face, but it couldn't melt the ice he felt inside. Harrison's speech the night before echoed in his mind. She knew he had been sincere, but it only complicated things. Sincerity did not erase the past, he did not heal the wounds she had buried for years. As much as he hated admitting, what he said had touched her. A part of her wanted to believe that he had really changed. Another part wanted to escape before he could hurt her again. Harrison appeared at the lounge door, hesitating to see her there alone. He looked more tired than usual, as if the internal struggle he waged was consuming his energy. When Clara realized her presence, she looked up, the rigid expression as usual, but her eyes betrayed a shadow of vulnerability. "Can I sit?" he asked, his soft, almost uncertain voice. Clara gestured to the armchair in front of him, crossing his arms as he settled. "I didn't expect you to stay at the same hotel after the conference," she said, the unpretentious tone, but with a touch of irony. "I wanted a chance to talk to you," he answered straight, his fixed eyes on hers. Clara took a deep breath, preparing for what she knew she was coming. "Why, Harrison? We already talked enough, don't you think?" "No," he said with an intensity that caught her by surprise. "We don't talk. Not about what really matters." She looked away, her throat tight. Whenever he approached the truth, she felt that she was about to collapse, like a castle of letters she had spent years building. Harrison leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, the lowest voice. "Clara, I know what I did was unforgivable. But if you give me a chance, I need you to know why." She stared at him, his expression a mixture of unbelief and exhaustion. "Do you want to explain? After all these years?" "Yes," he said, almost begging. "Because I don't know how to move on without you knowing the truth." Clara was silent for a long moment. The flames in the fireplace seemed to be the only living thing in the room. Finally, she nodded slightly. "So speak up." Harrison took a deep breath, as if preparing to dive into icy waters. "At that time, I was scared. Much more than I have ever admitted." "With what?" he asked Clara, his sharp voice. "With me, with myself," he answered, his voice breaking lightly. "I felt inappropriate. As if I could never be the man you deserved. You had such big, clear dreams. And I was so afraid to spoil everything." Clara felt something break inside her. His words were like a punch in the stomach. For years she had imagined 1,000 reasons for abandonment, but hearing the truth which he had left her because she didn't feel enough brought an unexpected pain. "Do you think this is a justification?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Didn't you think you could share this with me? What could we face together?" Harrison ran his hands on his face, clearly struggling to keep the composure. "I wanted, Clara. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed that the only right thing to do was let you go." She laughed, but there was no humor in her laugh. "Let me go? You destroyed me, Harrison. You didn't let me go. You abandoned me." Her words were like knives, but Harrison knew she deserved each one. He looked at her, his eyes shining with regret. "I know. And it was the worst decision of my life." Clara looked away, biting her lower lip to contain the tears. For years she had learned to be strong, not depending on anyone. But hearing this from him, it was like a crack had opened in his armor. "I built everything I have today because there was no other choice," she finally said, her lowest, but still loaded with hurt. "Because you made me believe that I couldn't trust anyone but myself." Harrison nodded slowly, his tight chest. "And everything you built is amazing, clear. I admire you so much. And that's what kills me, because I know that of all the people in the world, I was the one who failed you most." The silence that followed was heavy, full of things not said. Finally, Clara looked at him, and there was something new in his expression, a mixture of sadness and tiredness, but also a small flash of hope. "You really believe it has changed, aren't you?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "Yes," he answered, without hesitation. "But I don't want you to believe just because I'm saying. I want to show you." Clara looked away, processing her words. She was not ready to trust again, not completely. But for the first time in years, she felt that it might be possible. "I don't know if I can," she finally said, her voice shaking slightly. "But maybe I'm willing to see what you have to show." Harrison nodded, and for the first time since they met, he felt a spark of genuine hope. New York City shone in a cold splendor as Christmas night was approaching. The decorative lights sparkled around every corner, showcases displayed lush ornaments, and the air carried the distant sound from Christmas chants. Within the large hall of the Cole Resort headquarters, the atmosphere was equally magical. The tall ceiling was adorned with sparkling garlands, and a central chandelier bathed in a golden light. Harrison Cole was standing near the stage, adjusting the final details of the party. Despite the soft music and the joy of the guests around, he could not relax. Everything that night had a clear purpose. Clara would be there, and he knew this was his last chance to show her that he had really changed. When Clara arrived, the hall seemed to be quiet, at least for Harrison. She was stunning in a dark blue dress, with subtle details that resembled stars in the light. Her loose hair fell into soft waves on her shoulders, and there was a quiet composure in her posture that made her look untouched. The eyes crossed away, and Harrison, for a brief moment, forgot how to breathe. He smiled, but it was a hesitant smile, as if he knew that each movement that night could mean a breakthrough or setback. Clara approached, and he received her with a tone that mixed formality and sincerity. "You came," she gave a small but reserved smile. "You made a point of inviting me personally." "I thought I should." Harrison gave a gesture toward the salon. "I hope you enjoy." Clara just nodded, her eyes sweeping the environment before getting lost in thoughts. Later, while the guests' toast and the music filled the air, Harrison took the stage. He held a microphone, and the conversation in the room gradually decreased until all eyes were on him. "Good night, everyone," he began, his voice firm, but with a tone that suggested nervousness. "Before we continue with the festivities, I would like to share something personal." Clara, who was in the background, looked up, suspiciously. "Many of you know that Cole Resorts has always aimed to create memorable experiences. But for me, tonight is about something more than business. It is about restarts." He paused, looking for Clara in the crowd. When his eyes found her, he took a deep breath and continued. 10 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I left someone who was everything to me. Not because I didn't love her, but because I was terrified. I made a mistake that haunts me to this day." The room was silent. Many of the guests looked around, intrigued, while others murmured in recognition. Clara, however, remained motionless. Harrison lifted his hand, pointing to a side area of the hall, where a curtain was pulled, revealing a small exhibition of photos and objects. There were images of what would have been their wedding day, Clara in her dress, radiant and hopeful, and Harrison nervously, but smiling beside her. "I have kept these memories kept for all these years," he said, his voice a little softer. "Not to punish me, but to remember what I lost and what I need to be to never fail with someone like that." Clara felt a wave of emotion to take care of himself. The view of those photos transported her to the past, to a moment of expectation and vulnerability she spent years trying to bury. Harrison stepped ahead on stage, her voice loaded with emotion. "Clara," he said, looking straight at her, "I know that excuses are not enough. But I want you to know that if I could go back in time, it would do everything different. And if you give me a chance, I want to prove that I am a different man today." The room exploded in applause, but Clara hardly heard. The crowd looked like a blur as she processed what had just happened. Harrison later found her on one of the hall's terraces. The snow fell gently, covering the city with a tranquility that contrasted with the emotional storm inside them. Clara was on her back to him, her arms crossed as she watched the city's lights. As he approached, she spoke without turning around. "It was bold what you did inside. I needed you to know," he answered, his voice almost a whisper. Clara turned slowly, her look full of conflicting emotions. "And what exactly do you want me to do with it?" Harrison, he took a step closer, his eyes fixed on hers. "I want you to give me a chance. I can't erase the past, Clara. But I can show that the future may be different." She looked away, biting her lip as she fought against the tears that threatened to fall. "You don't understand," she said, the trembling voice. "I spent years building a life where I didn't have to trust anyone. A life where I couldn't be hurt, and I spent years hating myself for hurting you," he answered, his voice firm, but full of pain. "Clara, I'm not asking you to forget. I'm just asking you to consider." Clara looked at him, and for a moment he saw the vulnerability behind his facade. "I don't know if I can," she said finally. Harrison nodded, taking a small step back. "I don't expect you to decide now. But I'll be here, Clara. I will always be." She was silent, the sound of the snow falling by filling the void between them. Finally, she turned and returned inside, leaving Harrison alone on the terrace, but as she walked away, something inside her began to soften. Maybe, just maybe, she was ready to let the past go. The morning in New York was silent, wrapped in the sharp cold of a winter that seemed eternal. Clara was in her office, in the corner lit by natural light. The reflection of the accumulated snow outside made everything even brighter, almost blinding. But none of this seemed to penetrate the barrier of thoughts that occupied his mind. In front of her, at the table, was Harrison's invitation to an informal meeting. Only the act of holding him in his hands made her heart beat faster, mixing anxiety and something she hesitated to name, hope. She had spent the night in clear, pondering every word said by him at the party. The public exposure, the speech. All of this had moved deep layers that she believed to be asleep. But the fear was still there, clinging to her as a memory that trusting him again could bring pain. Clara closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Maybe it was time to risk it. When Clara arrived at the small meeting room at Harrison's office, he was already there, the casual but clearly nervous posture. Her presence in space seemed to fill every corner, and Harrison felt a wave of relief and apprehension at the same time. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice calmer than he really felt. Clara nodded, keeping a firm posture, but her gaze showed an opening that wasn't there before. She crossed her arms and settled in her chair, waiting for him to start. Harrison took a deep breath. "I know I can't ask you to forget what happened. But Clara, I want to show you that I can be someone you trust again. Clara watched him closely, every word he said being analyzed. But it was his tone, more than the words, which made her believe that he was being sincere. You understand that this will take time, don't you? She said finally, her low but firm voice. Yes, he answered promptly. The time you need. Clara released a long breath, as if carrying the weight of the decision she had just made. Okay, Harrison. I am willing to try. Harrison's heart almost stopped, but he didn't let the emotion take over. He knew he needed to respect her rhythm, but I want this to be more than just words, it remained clear. I want us to prove ourselves that we can work together, build something together. Harrison smiled softly, recognizing her determined tone that always fascinated him. I was waiting for you to say that, he said, pulling a document from the table. I thought, what if we do the project in the Colorado of ours? Clara stared at him with curiosity. Yes, he said, leaning a little forward. Not just a fusion between companies. Something more symbolic. We can unite our strength, our vision, and turn that land into a hotel that combines the best of both. Clara hesitated. The idea seemed bold, but she knew he was right. Working together could be a way of finding out if there was still room for confidence. Are you willing to give in to some parts? She asked, the slightly challenging tone. Harrison laughed softly. For you, Clara, I would give in to everything. Clara arched an eyebrow, but could not avoid a small smile. We'll see. The next months were intense but surprisingly rewarding. Harrison and Clara spent hours planning the project in Colorado, combining the luxury and sophistication of Cole resorts with the sustainability and warm charm of Bennett hospitality. Harrison frequently took clear herself as she spoke, seeing her passion that she had always inspired him. Every small interaction between them seemed a step in the right direction, but he was still careful. He knew that a slip could mean losing the progress they had made. Clara, in turn, noticed subtle changes in Harrison. He was more patient, more open to listening, and seemed genuinely committed to making the project something that represented both of them. Slowly, she began to lower her defenses, allowing herself to believe that he could really have changed. In a particularly cold day, as they inspected the ground in the Colorado, Clara and Harrison stopped in the middle of a snow-covered field. The wind blown gently, but the silence around was almost sacred. It's here, said Clara, looking at the empty space. Can you imagine what we can create together? Harrison looked at her, but not to the ground. He saw not only a business partner, but someone he wanted by his side on all the journeys. I imagine, he said, his voice loaded with emotion. But what we created together is greater than any hotel. Clara felt the heat rise to the cheeks, and for a moment the cold wind seemed to disappear. The inauguration of the new hotel in Colorado was scheduled for a day of clear sky, with the sun shining over the white snow cloak that covered the mountains around. The building, a masterpiece that combined the elegance of modern design with the harmony of sustainability, was the perfect symbol that Clara Bennett and Harrison Cole had achieved together. Clara was in the lobby, adjusting the last details. The soft lighting of the large windows allowed natural light flooded the space, highlighting the wood and stone elements that had been chosen to reflect the surrounding landscape. The Christmas decoration touches were subtle, but present, a tree decorated with simple and elegant ornaments, pine garlands on the doors and the light scent of cinnamon and vanilla hanging in the air. As she checked the guest list, Harrison approached her. He wore an impeccable suit, but there was something unpretentious in his posture that revealed the man behind the CEO. Clara didn't have to lift her eyes to know it was him. The sound of his steps was already familiar. Everything is perfect, clear, he said, smiling gently. She turned to face it, a glow of satisfaction. Perfect? I still see some details that need adjustments, she answered, but the tone was playful. Harrison laughed. You never change. Clara lifted an eyebrow, but her smile softened the provocation. Not even you. They looked at each other for a moment, the silence between them meaningful. It was no longer the heavy silence of past sorrows, but something new, a mutual recognition of how much they had traveled to get there. The first guests began to arrive, and Clara went to greet them, letting Harrison look at her from a distance. He knew that the success of that project was as hers as his, but what he most admired was the unshakable strength she displayed. Clara was a ray of light that illuminated everyone around her, and he knew that, by a miracle, he had gained a second chance to be by her side. When everyone was gathered for the inauguration ceremony, Harrison took the microphone. He started with a professional tone, thanking the partners and the team that made the project possible. But as she looked at Clara in the crowd, her voice changed, gaining a lightness that only she could bring out. This hotel is not just a milestone for our companies, he said, his voice loaded with emotion. It is a testimony of what is possible when two different views find a common purpose. Clara felt the heat rise to her face, but didn't look away. There was something about how he said a sincerity she learned to recognize as true. Harrison paused and then added, and to me this place is also a symbol of restarts. Because sometimes life gives us a second chance, and all we need to do is find the courage to grab it. The audience applauded, but Clara knew that those words were not for them. They were for her later. During the cocktail, Clara was on the hotel terrace, watching the mountains in the distance. The wind was cold but invigorating, and she pulled the coat closer to the body. Harrison appeared beside him, holding 2 cups of hot wine. He handed her one without saying anything, and together they were silent for a few minutes, enjoying the view. When he finally spoke, "Your voice was soft. Are you happy with the result?" Clara turned to him, watching his profile under the soft light of the terrace. "I am. Not only with the hotel, but with all this." He turned to face her, the serious look, but full of tenderness. "All this?" She gave a little smile, almost shy, something rare to Clara. "All this, Harrison. You. Me. We." Harrison felt her chest fill with something he could barely describe. Gratitude, relief, love, everything seemed to mix in a whirlwind that he had never experienced before. He held her hand, his fingers intertwined with hers. "I promise, Clara," he said, his voice full of emotion. "I promise I will never give you reason to doubt me again." Clara looked at him, and for the first time in years, she was completely vulnerable. "I know," she answered, the wind blown gently, and Clara leaned against the head of Harrison's shoulder. There, under the starry sky, with the mountains as witnesses, they found something that had escaped them for so long: peace. That night, while the last guests said goodbye and the hotel began to calm down, Clara and Harrison stayed in the big hall, now empty. The Christmas lights blinked gently, and the music that played in the background was slow and comforting. Harrison pulled Clara to the makeshift dance floor, and she laughed, surprised. "Here? Alone? Why not?" he said, holding her around the waist. They danced in silence, the music filling the space between them. Clara felt something she hadn't felt long ago: security. And Harrison, in turn, felt that she was finally exactly where she should be. Clara and Harrison's story ended there, but what they had built was just the beginning. The union of their strengths and their hearts was a reminder that sometimes love deserves a second chance, and that the spirit of Christmas can bring not only redemption but also hope for the future.